Hello, we are back going through our summer series, which is a study through the Old Testament. And today's going to be lesson 2. We're going to be going through the patriarchs. So last week we took a look at creation, the fall, the curse, and of course the prophecy, which is in Genesis 1 through 3, and just got a general overview of those topics. In chapter 3, verse 16, we specifically spoke about the prophecy concerning the coming Messiah and how God was going to redeem mankind. Today's reading is going to tie into that prophecy of the coming Messiah. Now, as Genesis unfolds, we see people looking for a potential savior. They look at Cain, obviously failed there, Abel, they look at Seth, and then Noah comes on the scene. And when he comes on the scene, mankind is at its absolute worst. We see that in Genesis 5, verses 5 through 8, just how bad it's gotten. This happens in such a relatively short time, all things considered, after creation. And it just shows the power of the corruption that sin does and how quickly it just corrupts the entire world. Many changes take place to our world after the flood. You can watch the movie Is Genesis History, a great documentary, and it will tell you more about the difference of the topography and those types of things. But we also see for the first time that mankind will begin to eat animals as a food source. So prior to the flood, we did not. We'll see that animals will have a fear of man in them and will begin to hunt one another. This is all stated in chapter 9 of Genesis. And in chapter 11 of Genesis, we see mankind, right after the flood, instantly rebel against God once again with the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel concludes with God confusing the languages and forcing mankind to obey his earlier command, which was to go forth, multiply, subdue the earth. So to spread out, in other words. And after this, we see Abram, later to be known as Abraham, comes on the scene. And this is important. This starts the patriarch era. And this is huge because it really is a revealing by God of his plan for salvation. It is another step in the process of bringing forth the Messiah. So today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3 for the beginning. I'd like you to turn there now, and I want you to read those verses 1 through 3 on your own. And while reading them, I want you to take notice of how many commands that you see and how many promises that you see God give Abraham just in these 3 verses. Go ahead and pause this video now, read 1 through 3 in Genesis 12, and look for those commands and promises, and then turn the video back on. Now, as we begin to look at these commands and promises, I want us to think about what exactly God was commanding Abraham in these verses, and what a truly big ask it really was. In this time and in this culture, to move away from your homestead, your family, your clan, to leave the land that you were used to, it was unheard of. It made no sense. It truly was an act of faith and an act of obedience by Abram to listen to God and obey him in this. The first command given to Abram was to go forth from the land. His land was called Ur. Now, later, that same land would be Babylon. It is today's modern-day Iraq, around the Baghdad area. And so to get to the Promised Land, which was the land of Canaan, which is modern-day Israel, they would have had to travel north using the Euphrates River, because the land in between those two countries was a huge, vast desert and was basically impassable. So he would have traveled north up the Euphrates River into what was later called Assyria, and then dropped down south into the land of Canaan, what is modern-day Israel. We see he is commanded to leave his relatives. He's commanded to leave his father's house. And he's commanded to go to a land that God will show him. But there is also one more command within these verses that you may not have picked up on. So in verse 2, I call it 2D. It's the fourth line within the verse. Many translations will say, and so you shall be a blessing. In the original Hebrew, this is actually a command, and it was better translated, and be a blessing. So God's actually commanding Abram to be a blessing in this land. Now let us look at the promises, and let's see if you guys got all the number correct there. So there are actually 6 distinct promises that God gives Abram in this statement. The first promise is that God will make Abram a great nation. It's important to recognize that Abram was childless at this point, so he had no heir, had no children of direct descent. This great nation that he speaks of course, is what's going to be known as Israel. The next promise God gives is, I will bless you. Now, this is a personal promise to bless Abraham himself. And we definitely see as we go through Genesis that Abraham's life has many blessings in it, both physical, like monetarily speaking and that type of thing, and also spiritually speaking, he's very blessed. So he's blessed both in the temporal aspect and in the eternal aspect. The next promise he makes is, I will make your name great. In other words, your name will be renowned among the people. It will stand out. It also gives this idea of both in his time and beyond. It's a name that will bring great respect and will never be forgotten throughout the history of humanity. The fourth promise that God gives Abram is, I will bless those who bless you. Now, this is going to speak both on a personal level, meaning during his lifetime, those individuals that would be a blessing in his life and be a blessing to him personally. But it also speaks on a national level, speaking of his descendants, which would be the nation of Israel. And that nation, those who bless that nation, will be blessed as well. And that is because Abram is the foundation to that nation. Now, the next promise is interesting along those same lines. It says, I will curse those who curse you. And once again, this is both speaking on a personal level, meaning people of that time frame cursing Abram, but it also means on a national level, meaning the nation of Israel, which he's the foundation. It's interesting, though, that the 2 Hebrew words here for curse are actually different. So the first Hebrew word for curse actually comes with a meaning of to abhor, to detest. In other words, it's more speaking of an attitude towards Abram or the nation of Israel, where the second word means to be diminished, to be cursed, to be disgraced. In other words, if people are even detested or are abhorred by Abram or the nation of Israel, God will return it by diminishing, disgracing, or cursing them or their nation if it was on that level. So in other words, those who hate or detest Abraham or the nation of Israel, God will diminish, disgrace, and curse. The 6th and final promise in this is a special one, of course. And he tells Abram, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, this is directly related to that prophecy that we saw last week in Genesis 3:16, speaking about the Messiah. So this is God revealing through this promise another step of how he's going to bring the Messiah. So we learn from this that the Messiah is going to come through the nation of Israel. We obviously, looking at hindsight, we know this to be true, as Jesus was Jewish. He was born of the line of Judah from the nation of Israel. So that is this step that we're seeing here through this promise, is that all the families of the world will be blessed, obviously through the Messiah, because it's only through him that we have salvation. I would like for us to look at the similarities between this passage, between how God interacts with Abram here and the promise that he gives Abram, and that of the promises that God gives us, the current day age believers within the church age. I'd like you to pause this video right now and discuss that within your group, thinking of the different similarities that the two may have, and then when you come back, we will talk about it. The first thing I want us to notice here is that Abram is chosen by God. And he's chosen solely by God's desire, having nothing to do or being apart from anything to do with Abram's ability to give something in return. We don't see Abram being some special person who can please God in a certain way or do something to earn this choosing. What we see is that God, solely of his own purpose, decides that he's going to use Abram in this way to glorify himself, that he will choose Abram to be this nation, this ambassador that is going to glorify himself. In that same way, in our own salvation in the church age, within the believers, we see the same way. We see that we are chosen, not because of something that we can offer to God or somehow earn in any way, shape, or form, but our salvation is given to us solely because God has chosen to do so. Not anything to do with what we have to offer. It's awesome, just this picture of grace that we see both in this Abrahamic covenant, this promise of the land that God gives, and how that correlates with our promise of salvation. The next thing I want us to note is the faith aspect. You know, as part of the promise, Abraham must have faith in God's calling and promise. And in the same way, as part of our salvation, we too must have faith in God's calling and promise. As a matter of fact, over 200 times in the New Testament are we told as believers to believe or have faith in. It's a command, and it's part of our salvation process. We must have faith, and it's by that faith that God gives us our grace, right? By faith alone. There's no works, as Paul said, lest any man should boast. And so in that way, these two are similar in that way as well, where the faith of Abraham about God's calling and promise is the same as our faith in God's calling and promise. The third is that it's non-revocable. Notice that the nation of Israel is given many subsequent promises by God that are based on obedience. However, this promise of land is always maintained regardless of whether or not Israel deserves it. See, God keeps his promises to Abraham and thereby Israel because he is faithful and true, even when they are not. And in the same way, God does the same thing with us. God gives us a promise of eternal life. This promise is not based on whether or not we deserve it. It's not based on whether we can maintain some super level of spirituality. But instead, God keeps his promise to us because he is faithful and true, even when we are not. And I think that's awesome to know. It takes a huge burden off our shoulders when we don't have to worry about that we're going to somehow displease the Lord in a way that he would take that salvation away. Have you ever had God give you a promise or give you a direction in your life, and you're pretty sure God has given it to you, but you're still a little nervous, you still have some anxiety, maybe there's some doubt, and you're not necessarily sure that God has really told you to do this, or maybe it's that you doubt the details. You're not sure exactly how he's going to accomplish this thing that he's asked you to do or pointed you in this direction. And it makes you a little nervous. And so you go back and you keep praying to God, like, God, tell me what step B and step C is. Like, give me some insight on what's happening. And it's those little seeds of doubt that are creeping in, even though you know that God's good and he's going to keep his promise to you. Well, Abram was a man just like you and I. He was human. And so he had these same fears, these same doubts. And because of that, in Genesis chapter 15, which I want us to turn to next, we're going to see some of those doubts and those fears come up, and we're going to see what God does in response to that. So go ahead and pause this video now and read chapter 15 of Genesis. As you read through the chapter, I'm sure that you recognized how Abraham questions some of the details of the promise given to him in chapter 12. He believes God will make him a nation, but he questions why God would use his servant to fulfill this promise, since Abraham has no children, and at this point he feels like he's too old to have children. God responds by telling Abraham that he will father a child from his own body, and that God will use this child to fulfill this national land promise. Abraham believes God, and in verse 6 it says that belief will be accounted to him as righteousness, or reckoned to him as righteousness. Now this is profound, because this is exactly what we see in the New Testament as well. Justification comes from faith alone and not by works. It brings us back to what we talked about last week, where the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament. He never changes. And just like with Abraham, his faith is accounted to him as righteousness. It's the same with us now in the church age, that our faith is accounted to us as righteousness. Now, I think it's important to note that only after this statement of faith by Abram, that God enters into this contract with Abram to reassure and to confirm his promise of the land and his promise of the nation, which he had given him earlier in chapter 12. So in verse 8 through 18, through the end of the chapter, we see this contract, or this promise taking place, where Abraham asks God for a sign. God responds by asking him to collect some animals for a sacrifice to be brought to him. Now these animals were cut into two pieces, into two halves. This was common practice of the day, and it literally was a contract. We can also see this being done in Jeremiah chapter 34 in verses 18 through 19. This would be the same thing as today, where we have a bunch of lawyers draft up a contract to make sure that both parties are liable to hold up their end of the deal. And that's exactly what this would have been. This contract between the two parties is where they would usually hold hands, or at the very least, they would pass through together in between these two animal pieces or animal carcasses. The idea was it was a contract of blood. Essentially, what it was saying was that if either party did not hold up their end of the deal, so to speak, then they would end up like these animals, dead. We then see that Abram falls into a deep sleep. This is actually the same Hebrew words for when God put Adam into a deep sleep and took the rib from him to create Eve. So while Abram is in this deep sleep, God gives him a dream. And in this dream, it's a prophetic dream that is telling him that his descendants, this nation that will come from him, will be in bondage, will be enslaved by another nation. We already know this to be Egypt. When we come to verse 17, we're going to hit what I really wanted to focus on today in this section. We see that as the sun sets, and it's very dark outside, that a fire oven and a torch, a flaming torch, pass through between these two pieces. Now, God is represented as fire. He's represented as the fire of this oven and of this torch. And it is reminiscent of the column of smoke in the fire that's going to lead Israel out of Egypt later when we get to Exodus. But it's key to notate that God passes through these two pieces. However, Abram does not. So the question is, why? Pause this video for a second and discuss it with your small group and think about why God would pass through, but Abram would not. All right. Hopefully what you noticed was that God is dictating once again that he will hold up his end of the deal regardless of Abram or his descendants. See, by Abram not going through, he is no longer bound by the contract. There is no end for him to hold up. It's a one-way contract. It is God contractually bound to keep his word and his end of the deal up, while Abram has nothing to hold up. This means that the promise is never contingent on Abram or his descendants' obedience, but rather it solely is on God. We should instantly see the parallel between God's promise here to Abram, this contract with Abram and his descendants, his physical descendants, and that of the promise that he gives us as believers in his son, Jesus Christ. You notice that our salvation is a promise. It's a contract, and it's given to us by God, and it's solely dependent upon him, with no regard to our ability to hold up our end of the deal or bargain. Just like Abram not passing through the carcasses, meaning that there was nothing for him to complete or maintain, in that same way, we too have no end game. We have no bargain that we have to hold up. There's nothing for us to maintain. Now, this is important because there are those out there who will try to burden believers with things that they need to do, things that they need to maintain their salvation promise. But as we see here, this way of thinking is not scriptural, and it doesn't line up with how God works. Jesus didn't only die for our past sins up to the point of believing in him, but he died for our past, our present, and our future sins. He stated firmly from the cross, "It is finished." Our salvation is complete by him and in him. That means there is no need for purgatory or for anything else. We don't have to maintain some certain level of holiness or righteousness in order to keep our salvation, because it's not about us. There's nothing for us to hold up. It's solely upon him. What a relief that is. Isn't it nice to know that God is so gracious and so good that regardless of what we do, if we have faith and we truly believe in what Jesus did for us, and we accept him and accept that free gift, that we don't have to worry about holding up our end of the deal. If we fall short, which we're going to because we're sinners, if we make a mistake, we're still saved. We're still within that contract, that promise, not because of us, but because of him, because he will always keep his word. He will always keep his promise. He will never let us down because God is truth. Next week, we will be going through the captivity and exodus of the nation of Israel, which God creates through Abraham. We'll be looking at an interesting story of a talking donkey, so be sure to tune in. It's going to be a lot of fun. Until then, I pray that God will continue to bless you this summer. I would plead honestly, that you would read your Bible every day as much as you possibly can. There's going to be times that you miss, I understand. But do your best to try to read every day, because it's through the reading of the Word that you're truly going to be able to connect with the Lord and get to know him better and understand those promises and the different things that God's called you to be. Also, I would ask that you're in prayer. Try to take 10 or 15 minutes a day. Pick one time a day that you set aside just to be in prayer, and actually be quiet for part of it and listen and see if God speaks to you back. But also pray without ceasing, right? So pray all throughout the day. You should be constantly in communion with the Lord. As I walk around all day long, I do this, and I really would hope that you would too. I'm constantly just giving thanks or asking the Lord, Lord, can you help me here or help me there? Just always be in communion with the Lord all throughout the day, but also have that separate, set outside part, that set apart time where you pray to the Lord. And then the third part that really helps with a healthy walk with the Lord is that of fellowship. Now, this doesn't mean that we completely are inclusive and we stay away from non-believers. Of course not, because we couldn't possibly be the salt of the earth. We couldn't be a light to the Gentiles. We couldn't be an ambassador for Christ if we were hidden away, right? So we need to interact with non-believers and with the world around us. But at the same time, we need that fellowship. We need to be plugged into the source. Just like a lamp on the hill, it needs an electrical outlet to connect it to the power. And fellowship is that for us. You really want to fellowship with believers as often as possible, because within that fellowship, Scripture teaches us that iron sharpens iron. So we're going to bless other believers as well as be blessed by other believers. We're going to be encouraging one another and teaching one another and strengthening one another. And that is where God will recharge us often, kind of recharge the battery, so that when we are back out in the world and we're facing those trials and tribulations, we kind of have that encouragement, and we have those things that we've learned to really guide us and push us towards what Hebrews 12 talks about, keeping our eyes on our author and finisher of our faith, which of course is Jesus Christ. So bless you guys. I will see you next week. God bless.